Hello, my friends. Thank you for spending a few moments with me for tonight's midweek moment. As you know, we've been in a series on the parables that Jesus taught, and tonight we're going to jump right in to a parable listed in Luke chapter 16. It's about a shrewd manager. Shrewd. Got to be careful about that word shrewd. Sounds like a story, really, when you read this parable. Sounds like a story that would lead the evening news at 6 o'clock. We're talking about price fixing. We're talking about dishonest employees. We're talking about financial kickbacks. Sounds like Washington, D.C. Just shows us that this kind of thing's been going on forever. Now, most commentators, most biblical theologians would agree that this is a somewhat difficult text to translate. Yet we know that Jesus used this parable, this story about a dishonest man, to teach his followers some very important spiritual truths. So let's jump right into it. Luke 16, pick it up in verse number 1. Jesus told this story to his disciples. There was a certain rich man who had a manager handling his affairs. One day a report came that the manager was wasting his employer's money. So the employer called him in and said, "What's this I hear about you? Get your report in order because you're going to be fired." Booyah. I mean, he called him in, called him on the carpet, and he said, "You're in big trouble." So what is it that we learn from this parable? We're going to talk about it tonight. We're going to pick it up next week as well. So it's really a 2-week look at the parable of the shrewd manager. First of all, when he was called on the carpet, he suddenly viewed his position quite differently. He viewed his position differently. When he got caught and had to answer for his actions, he looked at his job, he looked at his position in the company, and it looked completely different to him. He was reminded that he was working for another person. He was working for another man, that he was hired to manage another man's wealth. He realized that he was compensated and paid by another man. He realized that he was hired to be a manager or a steward, and he wasn't the owner of the company or the assets. This is a spiritual truth that all of us need to understand in our faith walk with Jesus. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse number 2, it says, "Now a person who is put in charge as a manager must be faithful." This man was simply put in charge to manage the owner's assets. And so as believers, as followers of Christ, we have to understand that God owns everything and that we are simply called to steward or to manage what the Lord entrusts to us. For example, God gives us time. We all have 24 hours a day. How do we manage our time? Do we manage it wisely? How much of that 24 hours do we give to the Lord? How much of that 24 hours do we serve the Lord or honor the Lord? We know that God gives us talents and abilities. How are we managing those talents and abilities? Whatever talents I have in my life or you have in your life, they're not just for us to do something for ourselves. They're also put in our life by the Lord so that we can serve the Lord with our talents and our abilities. We know God gives us finances, and we're responsible to manage our finances. How are we using the money that God puts into our hands? He's the owner. We're just the steward. He gives us a new life through Jesus Christ. Are we using our life to live for Him? Are we just using our life and our time and our money and everything else to live for ourselves? You see, this is another one of those parables that Jesus taught about money or wealth. And I know people say, well, money is not a spiritual issue, and I don't know why churches talk about money. Listen, 16 out of 38 parables that Jesus taught deal with money or wealth or possessions. I said it before, and I'll say it again tonight because I think it bears repeating. How we handle our money is a spiritual issue. Because God is the source. He blesses us. Yes, we work, and yes, we have to put in time and effort, and yes, we get paid for what we do. But God ultimately is the owner, and everything He puts into our hands, time and talent and money, we're just managers, we're not owners. So this guy suddenly saw his position in the company much differently. And as mature, wise believers, it's important that we accept the fact and realize and embrace the truth that God is the owner, God is the provider, and that we are simply managers and stewards of what He puts into our life. We also see here that this guy viewed his life differently. He viewed his life and his future differently. Now remember, this parable followed the parables in Luke chapter 15 about the prodigal son. And you remember the prodigal son requested his inheritance. He took his inheritance from his father, and he went out and wasted it. He squandered it away, partying, wasteful, riotous living. Both of these parables, parable of the prodigal, parable of the shrewd manager, are parables or stories that Jesus taught about making bad decisions, irresponsible decisions, wasting opportunities, and in this case, money that the Lord entrusted to him, okay? Now, look at chapter 16, verse number 3. The manager thought to himself, now what? My boss has fired me. I don't have the strength to dig ditches, and I'm too proud to beg. So all of a sudden he had this position, and he was being dishonest in his position, and he realized, I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to get fired. And I don't want to dig ditches. I don't want to do manual labor. I'm too proud to go out and beg. What am I going to do? So when the owner heard of this manager's waste of his money, he requested an audit. And when the manager heard and the owner wanted to see the books and he was going to audit his behavior and how he was handling the owner's money, he suddenly saw his life differently. Dude, I'm going to get fired. I'm not going to have any money. I'm not going to have a job. I'm not going to have a place to live. I've been so caught up in using my owner's money in the wrong way and living a life that I shouldn't have been living. Now all of a sudden, I'm out on the street, and I've made no plans for my life or for my future. You know what I've seen? I've seen this movie play out way too many times in real life. I've watched people ignore Jesus. I've watched people waste their time, waste their talent, waste their money. I've watched people waste their life. I've listened to people make excuse after excuse why they can't come to church, why they can't serve the Lord, why they can't surrender their life to Christ, and then all of a sudden, a crisis happens. All of a sudden they lose their job, or they're going to lose their home, or there's a serious physical situation, a health situation in the family, or death in the family's going to split up. Something major happens, and then it's a wake-up call. What about, I've been wasting my time. I've been wasting my talent. I've been making excuses and doing things I shouldn't have been doing, and all of a sudden now I have to face an audit. Jesus is asking me some questions, and I better have some answers. Think about that. Listen, how we manage our life is important. We are stewards of what God puts into our hands, and ultimately, He's the owner. Now, we're going to pick this up next week, and we're going to talk a little bit more. In fact, we'll finish this parable off next week. But in the meantime, let me ask you a question. What are you doing? What are you doing with your life? What are you doing with your talent? What are you doing with your time? What are you doing with your money? What are you doing with the family that God has entrusted to you? Are you and I, we have to ask ourselves this question, are you and I being good stewards of what the Lord has entrusted to us to manage? That's a very, very valid question. And it's a question that Jesus is going to ask of us. And it's better that we have the answer now and not wait until there's a crisis in our life. I appreciate you. Again, we'll pick it up next week. right back here, 7 o'clock Wednesday night. In the meantime, I want to give you a personal invitation. Join us here at New Life in the Big House every Sunday morning, 9:15 and 11:15. I'll be looking for you right here.